So this is a story all about murder, crime, and evil sisters. Hey babes, what's up? It's Lorena. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. Some of you may or may not know, but in my free time, I binge listen and binge watch true crime documentaries, podcasts, videos, anything I can get my hands on. So since this weekend is Halloween, I decided to try something I've been wanting to do for quite a while, and that's covering a case. So today's case takes us all the way south of the border to Mexico. So grab your seats, grab your snacks, and hold on tight because it's going to be a wild ride. Warning: the following presentation is intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. Delfina, Maria de Jesus, Maria del Carmen, and Maria Luisa, also known as Eva, were their names, and crime was their game. They were born in the early 20th century in El Salto, Jalisco. So like most criminals, it is said that they grew up in a very dysfunctional family. Their father, Isidro Torres, was the town sheriff. He was known to be an alcoholic and a very violent man, and would physically abuse the girls and their mother. It's also said that he would force the sisters to watch him torture some of the people he would detain. Now their mother, Bernardina Valenzuela, was said to be a religious fanatic, so I'm sure that was also fun. It's also said that when they were teens and wanted to get a little dressed up, wear a little makeup, if their dad saw them, like with makeup and risque clothing, he would beat them up or put them in a cell at the town jail to teach them a lesson. Can you imagine? If he was my dad, I think he would have just locked me up and thrown away the key, honestly. Like, when one of the sisters, Maria del Carmen, and we're just gonna call her Carmen because why not, was a teen, she decided to run away with her boyfriend who was older than her. I mean, I wonder why things seem so great at home. Unfortunately, her dad caught up with them before they got too far, and he put Carmen in the town jail as punishment. That very same day, her dad had to go arrest a guy in town because he had allegedly committed several crimes. But there was an altercation during the arrest, and Isidro, their dad, ended up shooting the alleged criminal in the back, which killed him. And this is commentary, but it's interesting how we still see a lot of that today all over the world. After this, Isidro packed his bags and was like, I'm outie. Like, he disappeared from the town and his family's life forever. He just left them behind. I wonder why he didn't take them with him. The family ended up changing their last name from Torres to Gonzalez, so people wouldn't associate them with their dad as much, and kind of just to get a new fresh start in life. So from that moment on, their last name would be Gonzalez Valenzuela. Now, remember Carmen? She was still back at the jail. Her dad didn't even bother getting her out of the cell before he left town. So she stayed there for another 14 months. I honestly wonder why the officers didn't just let her out. I mean, she had committed no crime, but how did she get out, you ask? Well, the owner of a restaurant or a store in the town actually ended up paying the fine to have her liberated. Apparently, they had started a relationship while she was locked up, and Carmen was still a teen, and this dude was in his 50s. Carmen actually ended up marrying this creep sometime later, and they had a son together, their only son, or her only son. And I guess things fizzled out with her old creepy husband because she ended up moving back in with her family shortly after. And 3 years later, so around 1938, Carmen met a man named Jesus Vargas. She fell in love with him and moved in with him pretty early in their relationship. People around the town seemed to be very confused and judgy about their relationship because Jesus was older than her too, and he had a reputation of being a criminal and a gold digger. Or I guess the right word is a freeloader, but basically he was used to having women take care of him financially rather than the other way around, and this was very uncommon at the time, especially in Mexico. So together they opened a cantina or bar, whatever you want to call it, but this was not a nice place. It was said to be very sketchy and filled with lowlifes and criminals. That's what my research said. However, their bar did well, surprisingly, and unsurprisingly, Jesus started to spend all of their earnings from it. Jesus was such a spender that they basically ended up bankrupt, and due to this whole situation, they ended their relationship. Throughout the course of all of this, the other three sisters, Maria de Jesus, Delfina, and Maria Luisa, had been working in a textile factory under horrible conditions with meager wages, and they were tired of it. Soon after, their mom died and left them a small inheritance, so Delfina, who had been inspired by Carmen's success with the bar, decided that she was going to use the inheritance to open up her own establishment, a brothel. So this is kind of the fork in the road of the story, and it could have gone in a completely different way, but it didn't, and we're here telling the story. So, during this time, prostitution was illegal in the state of Jalisco, but this apparently was no obstacle for Delfina. So this is said to be when they first started luring in girls and young women. I thought about calling these victims sex workers, but they were more like sex slaves because they were kept against their will in absolutely horrible conditions. So the sisters and their accomplices would travel around to poor rural areas all over Mexico and convince young girls, usually between the ages of 12 to 15, to come to the city with promises of helping them get jobs as live-in domestic workers and waitresses. They didn't always have to convince the families of these girls, because if they saw a young girl walking by herself, they would just stop the car and take her. The families of these young girls saw the promises of the sisters as a great opportunity for the girls to earn money and get out of these poor towns, and they would entrust their daughters to these women. Sadly, most of these families would never see their daughters again. As soon as the girls arrived at the brothel for the first time, they were stripped naked, examined, and then raped by the male accomplices of the sisters. Some of them were kept virgins until they were sold to the highest bidder. If the young girls tried to put up too much of a fight, they were brutally beaten by the men working for the sisters. After suffering brutal sexual assault, they were bathed with ice water and given a dress and made to start sex work that very same night at the brothel. The victims were all locked in a room of the brothel when they were not working, and there were usually around 20 girls at a time. The room was disgusting, with human excrement on the floor because they didn't have a bathroom in there. These girls were also very malnourished because they were only fed once a day, and a lot of them were very, very sick with a variety of illnesses like STIs and just a whole bunch of other stuff. Something I found very interesting about these sisters is that even though they ran a brothel, they were still very religious. They didn't see prostitution as a sin, but they had rules in the brothel. They did not allow kissing between the clients and the sex slaves. They also did not allow sexual acts between people of the same sex, and a variety of other things. They were very serious about these rules. They even had little peepholes in all of the private rooms so they could keep an eye on the clients and the girls and make sure that the rules were being followed. This is my personal commentary, but it's just so interesting that the sisters were able to twist their religious beliefs so their ideas would justify in their mind the horrible things they were doing to so many young girls. If any of the girls broke the rules or upset the sisters in any way, they were horribly beaten and sometimes killed as punishment. Also, if any of the girls got pregnant, they were made to abort the babies in horrible and unsanitary conditions, and usually these abortions were performed by one of the sisters. Many of the victims died from problems related to these abortions, such as infection and just being unable to stop the bleeding. If the babies were born, they and sometimes the mother was killed. And if all of this wasn't bad enough, when the victims reached the age of 25, they were considered too old to work in the brothel, and instead of being released, they were killed. The ways in which the women were killed varied. Sometimes they would be locked in a dark room with no food or water until they starved to death, or they would be buried alive. Even worse, at times, the other sex slaves were forced by the sisters or their henchmen to kill one of their own. And if they didn't do what they were told, they would be killed as well. This was said to be another way that the sisters would manipulate the victims. They would tell them that if they ran away, they would kill their families, or they would tell the authorities that they had murdered someone. It really left these victims with no hope of getting away. This is probably a little hard to understand, but some of the girls started working for the sisters to improve their own living conditions. They would torture the other girls who weren't following the rules, or by luring in new victims. It's very sad, but many did this so they would not be killed, tortured, and have a little bit more food. So back to the sisters, Carmen actually started working the cash register at Delfina's Tavern and Brothel. She would also sell things like makeup, shoes, and clothes to their sex slaves, and this was a way for the sisters to make more money because they would upcharge everything they sold to these women, but it was also a way to keep them moneyless and in debt, so they could not buy their freedom or have money to escape. While Carmen was in charge of that, Maria Luisa was in charge of the kitchen, and obviously she was not doing a good job because these girls were malnourished. And then in 1948, there was a huge fight that forced the sisters to close the brothel and get the heck out of El Salto, and of course, they brought along some of the sex slaves. And a year after running away from El Salto, Carmen died. After Carmen's death, Maria de Jesus, her sister, found Carmen's notebook, where she kept tabs on how much each sex slave owed her from her sales in clothing and makeup. But guess what? Maria de Jesus didn't know how to read. How is she gonna know who owed her how much? This is commentary, but I wonder why she didn't just ask her sisters to help her figure it out. She had a bright idea. She decided to basically forgive and forget these dads if the sex slaves would just pray for Carmen's soul. I mean, honestly, I don't think it was gonna do much, but I also wonder if they actually did it or just said they did. Maybe Maria de Jesus forced them to pray out loud or something, who knows, but that's just a question. So by this time, Delfina and Maria de Jesus had gone to San Francisco del Rincon in Guanajuato, and in this state, brothels were legal. This is when they opened a brothel under the name of El Guadalajara de Noche. During this time, Maria de Jesus met an optometrist that owned a brothel that was named El Poquianchis. Dun, dun, dun! They bought it from him and renamed it La Barca de Oro, but the people of the town were so used to the name of El Poquianchis that they just called it by its previous name. And this is how the sisters got the nickname Las Poquianchis, which they absolutely hated. This is commentary, but I looked up the definition of Poquianchis, and it's basically slang for someone who is very frugal. So no wonder they didn't like being called that. I mean, who does? At this time is when the sisters started to perform sexual favors for local government officials in Guanajuato. In exchange for these favors, the officials would approve all of the necessary permits for their brothel to run on the margins of legal. El Poquianchis, aka La Barca de Oro, turned out to be their most successful brothel. They even had sex workers coming from the US to work in their establishment. That's how popular it was. And it's said that government officials, policemen, business owners, townspeople, military officers, basically all types of men were clients of theirs. So now let's bring in two of their most well-known male accomplices into the picture. First up, we have Hermenegildo Zúñiga, which is such a weird name, also known as El Capitán Águila Negra or Captain Black Eagle in English. He was Delfina's lover. And next up, we have Salvador Estrada Bocanegra, also known as El Verdugo, or the Executioner. Literally. I'm not playing, that was literally what the sisters called him. So Capitán Águila Negra was in charge of carrying out punishments or taking the victims who broke the rules or tried to escape from the brothel to the sisters' ranch, which was called Rancho San Angel, like literally Ranch Saint Angel or something like that, which is so ironic. And this ranch was way worse than the brothel, if you can imagine that. I mean, it was said to be like a concentration camp. El Verdugo was the one who took over once the victims arrived at the ranch. Once there, the girls were beaten and tortured with large sticks that had nails sticking out at the end, or hot metal or coals were put on their bodies, and so many other crazy torture methods that they came up with. In 1963, there was a law passed in Guanajuato which made brothels illegal, so the sisters packed up and moved back to Lagos de Moreno, Jalisco. This was actually good news for Delfina because she was able to see her son Ramon, also known as El Tepo. It's said that she worshipped the ground he walked on. She absolutely loved her son. So once there, the sisters established their new brothel and business was booming again. But one fateful night, Ramon got into an altercation with some local officers that were demanding higher bribes. Things got out of control and the officers shot and killed Ramon, another killing by police officers. The news of his death absolutely destroyed Delfina, and she ended up grabbing a gun and shooting up the place in an attempt to kill the officers who had killed her son. Eye for an eye type of stuff. She then had her mans, El Capitán Águila Negra, track down and kill the remaining officers who shot Ramon. After this night, the sisters dressed in black to grieve the death of Delfina's only son for the rest of their lives. And they forced all of their sex workers to dress in black as well. Law enforcement in the town did not take Delfina's actions lightly, and they shut down the brothel as revenge. They actually sealed the doors of the establishment with 20 women still inside, including Maria de Jesus. They left them without running water or food, and the women who were able to escape the building were detained immediately by officers as soon as they made it out. Somehow, Maria de Jesus and a few of the sex slaves were able to make it out of the building and went back to Rancho San Angel in Guanajuato, the camp of horrors. Not horrors, horrors. During their time back at the camp, the victims were so malnourished and sick that they were just dying. At one point, Delfina's man, El Capitán Águila Negra, brought peanuts for the girls, and one of them was so malnourished that her body could just not digest the peanuts and she died. The remaining girls in the room were told to get her decomposing body out of there, but they were so sickly they couldn't do it, so her body was basically thrown out the second-story window of the building. In January of 1964, Catalina Ortega, one of the sex slaves being held at the ranch, was able to escape through a small hole in the room the victims were being held in. She was able to make it back to her mother's house a few towns over. Once reunited, she was convinced by her mother to tell the authorities in the city of León, Guanajuato, what had happened to her. Catalina walked into the judicial office of the city of Guanajuato looking malnourished, disheveled, with visible bruises and cuts, and finally revealed her terrifying and gruesome story. Thankfully, the officers in the city were not on the sisters' payroll, unlike the ones back at the town. On January 14th, 1964, armed with a search warrant, the authorities went to the ranch and they were able to rescue 17 women, 3 children, and arrested 2 of the sisters, Delfina and Maria de Jesus, and of course their henchmen. As the victims were being led out of the house, they would point to different places around the property and tell the officers where the bodies of the other victims were buried. Once the officers started digging, they found lots of fetuses along with corpses of many young female victims and also the bodies of many male clients. So it was later revealed that the sisters would have clients that were carrying a lot of cash, killed to take their money, as well as clients that owed them large amounts of money. As the authorities dug around the property, they found the bones of around 91 women, men, and fetuses. The people of the town were absolutely outraged and horrified once they found out what had happened at the ranch, although I'm sure a few of the townspeople were regular clients. And the townspeople demanded that the police release the sisters to them so they could lynch them. Unfortunately, the police did not do this. The news of Las Poquianchis and their horrible crimes made it all over Mexico and probably to other countries pretty fast. Once Maria Luisa, who was living in another state at the time and presumably running her own brothel, heard the news, she made her way to where her sisters were being held. She had actually been promised immunity in exchange for information, but once she got there, she was arrested as well. Now, this part is what really makes my blood boil, but listen to this. Once in prison, the sisters denied the charges against them and said that they were innocent and that they had never killed anyone. And even if they didn't personally kill any of the victims, they were the ones who orchestrated the capture, rapes, and torturous murders of many of these young women. Their sentencing took a few months, and some of the victims who had been rescued testified against them in court. At long last, 3 sisters were sentenced to 40 years in prison each. This was the maximum prison sentence at the time in the state of Guanajuato. And what happened to the few living victims? Some of them were able to reunite with their families, while others had no other means of living, so they went back to the only thing they knew: sex work. Hopefully, this time it was under their own terms. This is my commentary, but do you guys believe in karma? Well, in 1968, there was some plumbing work being performed at the prison where Delfina was being held in. The plumbers were working right above her cell, and basically, they accidentally dropped a bucket filled with cement on her big ol' ugly head. Even if it wasn't an accident, is anyone really mad that happened to her? This accident fractured Delfina's skull and spine. She was unable to get up from her bed because of the injuries, and only sobs of pain and agony could be heard coming from her cell for several days until she finally died. And honestly, she was said to be the most cruel by far of the 4 sisters, so I think she finally got what she deserved. At least a little bit, like just a little bit of what she deserved. In 1984, 16 years after the death of Delfina, Maria Luisa died from liver cancer while in prison. And then there was one. Maria de Jesus was released from prison after having served only 27 years of her 40-year sentence. She immediately married a man she met while they were both in prison, so I'm sure he was a great choice. Nothing is really known about what she did with the remainder of her life, but she finally died in the mid-1990s. and I hope it was painful. I wanted to mention briefly that there's a lot of rumors surrounding this case, like that the sisters forced the victims to engage in acts of bestiality or satanic rituals, but I don't really believe it because they were such crazy religious old crows. However, they did pick and choose what they thought was acceptable and what they considered a sin, so who knows? And in 2002, workers were clearing land for a building down the street from the infamous ranch when they found the remains of about 20 people in a mass grave. The authorities stated that the bodies were buried there in the 1950s or 1960s and attributed them to Las Poquianchis. So that raised their estimated kill number to around 110 people. However, that still leaves all of the other properties where they had their previous brothels, and I personally believe there are more corpses to be found. As of now, authorities believe they were responsible for the deaths of over 150 people, and many of these corpses may never be found. I also wanted to mention that Rancho San Angel, the horrible concentration camp of horrors place, is actually now a rehabilitation center, which I don't know if it's such a good idea. Overall, it seems to me that Las Poquianchis had a lot of help in all of the evil they caused. So many government officials, policemen, henchmen helped these sisters in establishing the huge sex trafficking ring they had. Corruption played a huge part in allowing them to get away with the crimes for as long as they did, and a lot more people should have been held accountable for this. So that's the case of Las Poquianchis, Mexico's murderous sisters. I hope you guys learned something new or found this case interesting. If you'd like to see me cover more true crime stories, make sure you give this video a like and leave me a comment telling me which case you'd like me to cover in the future. That's it from me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!